I used to think I knew myself. I had a life that many around me would call stable. A good job, a few small achievements, enough to satisfy my family. Relationships that weren't deep but kept my social life from falling apart. Days passed in steady repetition, as if there were a ready-made machine and I only needed to step in and follow. I never stopped to ask why I was walking that road, because it didn't seem wrong. I lived like someone who was living nothing remarkable, nothing terribly bad. And then one afternoon, sitting alone in the room where I often read, or simply hide from the city's noise, I suddenly felt an unusual emptiness. Nothing dramatic had happened. No loss, no shock, just a silence. In that silence, a question rose up unexpectedly, as if from the bottom of a deep well. Who am I? At first, I thought it was just a passing thought, some tired philosophical phrase I'd seen in old books. But strangely, that question didn't float away like other thoughts. It clung to me, not in a frightening way, but like something quietly gentle and persistent. It felt weighty. Not the weight of words, but the weight of something I'd never looked at directly. I became confused. Why would such a simple question make me sit motionless for nearly half an hour, staring into space, as if I had lost my direction and at the same time been awakened? I used to think I was my name, my job, my relationships, my memories. But when that question rang true, all those things blurred like paint on a surface beginning to peel. From that moment, I didn't live as before. Not that I changed instantly, but something inside shifted quietly, like an underground current. Everything I did, everything I thought, felt watched by an inner eye, asking, who is doing this? Who is thinking this? I had no answer. Instead of frightening me, it felt like stepping into an unexplored land. I didn't tell anyone about the question, because I knew most people would think it a psychological game, a fantasy, or just a mild adult life crisis. But for me, it was an inner call, unobtrusive yet deep and real, so real that I couldn't pretend not to hear it. Once you hear it, you can't live carelessly anymore, because you know behind all the daily actions there is something waiting to be recognized, something you can't name, but without which everything else seems meaningless. I can't remember the exact moment the crisis began, because it didn't arrive like a fierce storm. It arrived quietly, like a tiny crack in the mind that, over time, widened steadily and silently. At first, the familiar life only felt dull. Jobs that once made me feel important became mechanical. Conversations with friends, though still full of laughter and sharing, left an unnamed silence inside me. I began to feel as if I were playing a role, and oddly, I no longer believed in that role. I didn't understand why I felt this way. Outwardly, everything remained fine, but inwardly, something was collapsing. I lost interest in things that used to excite me, goals, plans, even small pleasures. I woke each morning with a question hovering in my head. What is any of this for? Increasingly, I felt like I was walking inside a transparent box, seeing everything, but no longer connected to it. Even amid a crowd, I felt lonely. It wasn't loneliness because there was no one beside me. It was loneliness because I had lost myself. I went to work, completed the tasks, met relatives, but like a programmed machine, everything I did was correct, matched expectations, fulfilled responsibilities, yet utterly soulless. I began to lose sleep, not because of any particular stress, but because my mind had nothing to cling to. I lay there staring at the ceiling as questions dug into my heart like knives. Who am I in this vast river of life? Does this life have any real purpose? Or is it merely a repeating loop of roles and reactions? If I die tomorrow, what will remain? In that moment, I first understood what an existential crisis means. It is not ordinary sadness tied to a concrete event. It cannot be solved with advice or positive thinking. It is like a yawning abyss, opening in the middle of everyday life. And though I was still living, still breathing, I felt myself falling into nothingness. All the meanings I once held became fragile. Fame, money, recognition, none of it convinced me anymore. I did not want to lose those things, but I no longer understood why I was living. I didn't tell anyone, because I knew people would advise me to travel, change my environment, or see a doctor. But how could I express that the emptiness I felt could not be filled by anything external? How could I explain that the problem was not lack, but the dawning clarity that everything I once thought important carried no weight against the question of existence itself? I knew that if I didn't honestly face that void, I would live the rest of my life like a speaking corpse, continuing the performance, repeating the loop, trying to convince myself everything was fine. I did not want that. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I couldn't go back. The question, who am I, had become a flame, burning through every layer of paint, and now I stood bare, with nothing to hold on to, no comforting answer, I didn't know where I was heading, but I knew I had to move. I had to step into that vast darkness, not because I wanted to, but because there was no other path. And I secretly hoped that somewhere in this desperate emptiness, there might exist some form of truth. As the existential crisis spread inside me, I felt I could not simply sit and wait for a miracle. I needed to do something to find an exit, or at least a temporary answer to the burning question. Not knowing where to begin, I did what anyone lost might do. I turned to books. From popular self-help titles to classical philosophy, I read everything I could, holding a fragile hope that somewhere among the words there would be someone, a teacher, a philosopher, a sage who had gone through something similar and could give me a plausible, convincing, practical answer. For a short while, I thought I had found it, some definition of self, personality, or personal mission that sounded reasonable. I clung to it like a lifebuoy and started attaching new labels to myself. I am the responsible one. I am the seeker of truth. I am the awakened one amid an unconscious crowd. For days, even weeks, I felt better. I thought I was getting closer to an answer. But then, as if on a fixed cycle, that feeling dissolved. Each time I held onto a new definition, it quickly revealed its fragility. A small setback, a bad day, an unexpected failure, and I fell into the same deep hole. Everything I had labeled myself with could not withstand the unpredictable movements of life. I realized every label I chose was only a new shell, nicer, more refined, but still a shell. I turned to others. I asked friends, older people, those I believed had depth. Some told me to practice spirituality. Others said, focus on work to avoid distraction. Someone said I was overthinking. Someone else advised me to seek faith. I tried. I followed guided meditations. I set new career goals. I tried praying, even though I didn't truly hold religious faith. It wasn't loneliness because there was nobody beside me, but loneliness because I lacked myself. I went to work, completed tasks, met relatives but like a programmed machine. Everything I did was correct. Met expectations, fulfilled responsibilities, yet utterly soulless. I began to lose sleep, not because of any specific stress, but because my mind had nowhere to hold on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, while questions dug into my heart like knives. Who am I in this vast current of life? Does this life really have a purpose? Or is it just a loop of roles and reactions? If I die tomorrow, what will remain? In that moment I understood, for the first time, what an existential crisis, island. It is not ordinary sorrow tied to a particular event. It cannot be solved by advice or by thinking positively. It is like a yawning abyss opening in the middle of everyday life. And though I was still living, still breathing, I felt myself falling into nothingness. All previous meanings became fragile. Fame, money, recognition, none of it convinced me. I did not want to lose those things, but I no longer understood why I was living. I didn't tell anyone, because I knew people would tell me to travel, change my environment, or see a doctor. But how could I express that the emptiness I felt could not be filled by anything external? How could I explain that the problem wasn't lack, but that I had begun to see clearly that everything I once thought important carried no weight when faced with the question of existence itself? I knew that if I didn't honestly face that void, I would live the rest of my life like a speaking corpse, continuing the performance, repeating the loop, convincing myself everything was fine. I didn't want that. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I couldn't go back. The question, who am I, had become a flame burning through every layer of surface paint, and now I stood bare, with nothing to cling to, no comforting answer. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I could not stop moving. I had to step into that vast darkness, not because I wanted to, but because there was no other path. And secretly, I hoped that somewhere in this despairing emptiness, there might exist some form of truth. As the existential crisis widened inside me, I felt I could not simply sit and wait for a miracle. I needed to do something, find a way out, or at least a temporary answer to the burning question in my chest. Not knowing where to begin, I did what anyone confused might do. I turned to books. From popular self-help to classical philosophy, I read everything I could, clinging to the fragile hope that somewhere among the words there would be someone, a teacher, a philosopher, a sage who had undergone something similar and could hand me a reasonable, convincing, and practical answer. For a short while I thought I had found it, some definition of self, personality, or personal mission that sounded plausible. I grabbed it like a life preserver and began to tag myself with new labels. I am the responsible one. I am the seeker of truth. I am the awakened among the unconscious crowd. For days, even weeks, I felt better. I thought I had drawn closer to an answer. But then, as if by a preset cycle, that feeling dissolved. Each time I clung to a new definition, it quickly exposed its fragility. A small setback, a bad mood, an unexpected failure, and I fell into the same deep pit. Everything I attached to myself could not withstand the unpredictable motion of life. I realized every label I chose was only a new shell, prettier, more refined, but still a shell. I turned to others. I asked friends, older people, those I believed had depth. Some told me to practice spirituality. Others advised me to focus on work to avoid distraction. Someone said I was overthinking. Someone else told me to find faith. I tried. I practiced guided meditation. I set new career goals. I tried praying, even though I didn't truly hold religious belief. But all of that only soothed me temporarily. The question, who am I, did not disappear. It only retreated to a corner and then suddenly re-emerged at moments I least expected, even when I was laughing with friends or receiving praise at work or from family. It rose like a thin smoke into my mind. Is all of this real? Is there anything here that is truly me? I began to try to flee from it. I spent more time on social media, binge-watched shows, plunged into short-term relationships, joined gatherings that brought no meaning just to feel normal. But the busier I got, the more exhausted I became. And at night, when the outside world fell silent, that old question rang again. It didn't need to shout. Its quiet, wordless repetition was enough to unnerve me. Sometimes I felt angry with myself. Why couldn't I live like others? Why did I have to dig up questions no one else needed to ask? But right after the anger came a deep, indescribable sadness. I understood I could not go back. I no longer believed anyone or any place could give me the answer. I began to see clearly that every answer I had chased, however beautiful or noble, was just a fabricated response to something inauthentic, like a self, trying to define itself through things that can change, things that can be lost. Thus, every attempt at definition ended in disappointment. At that point, I didn't have high hopes, but I also stopped struggling. I felt I was at a crossroads. Either I would keep circling forever in the maze of invented answers, or I had to look straight at the question. Not to answer it, but to look at it directly, and from that moment the true journey into the self began. I don't remember the exact moment. Perhaps it came in ordinary instance, like when someone praised me for being kind, or when I tried to please a family member while feeling annoyed. Each time, I noticed two layers inside me, one that acted according to a role and one that silently observed. At first, I thought it was fatigue, a reaction to overload. But as days passed, it became clearer. I was not living as myself, but as an image I thought I should be. I began to notice the labels I had worn since childhood: obedient child, talented one, the reasonable person, the ideal lover, the responsible one. Those words once gave me a sense of value, but looking back now, they seemed like layers of pasted shells stacked on top of each other. None of them was the real me. They were just names, and as I was beginning to understand, a name had never been the essence. One evening I sat before a mirror, not to groom myself but simply to face the other, who had lived with me for years, whom now I no longer felt I truly knew. I looked at my face and suddenly asked, if everything people know about me were erased, name, past, relationships, jobs, who would remain in the mirror? That question made me breathless. The person in the glass looked back, yet something felt so strange that I felt like a stranger in my familiar body. I recalled each phase of my life where I had chosen a role to live by. When I failed, I labeled myself useless. When praised, I believed I was special. When hurt in love, I played the victim. Among more successful people, I became insignificant. So I kept changing myself, like an actor changing costumes, a role for each circumstance, a mask for every scene. Then I realized something crucial. Those roles existed only because I believed I was them. No one forced me to be the pitiable one. No one compelled me to be the strong one. I had chosen those masks myself. To cover up something deeper, more vulnerable, and inexpressible, perhaps the fear of being truly seen, perhaps the emptiness. Nothing can fill the roles or shields. If those performances collapsed, what would be exposed was something fragile. The first time I looked straight at the idea of the self, it wasn't as a philosophical concept, but as something operating inside me every day, every minute. I no longer saw the self as distant. I felt it as a reflexive system, constantly trying to create an image of me and protect that image at all costs. When someone criticized it, it reacted. When someone praised it, it celebrated. When I was lonely, it pretended to be sufficient. When I was afraid, it put on a cloak of calm. But behind all those layers of reaction was an empty abyss with no shape, no answer, only a presence watching and knowing every subtle movement. I panicked. It felt like witnessing myself being stripped bare. There was nothing left to call me except a string of memories, images, and roles I had unconsciously embraced. Yet alongside that fear came an inexplicable relief, because for the first time, I didn't have to try to be anyone. I was simply watching. I was not the good person, not the bad person, not anything specific. I was simply seeing, and that brought a strange freedom. From that moment, I began to notice something that knew all the masks at work, yet was not those masks. A quiet seat that needed no proof, silently recognizing each simulated layer I had mistaken for myself. I couldn't fully explain what it was, but I understood that if anything was truly worth seeking, it would not be found in what I had always believed to be me. I once thought that if I exposed the self, if I peeled away every role, shell, and reflex I'd attached to the I, then I would be free. I believed that merely seeing those things as false would be enough to step beyond them. But I was wrong. Recognizing the self was not like taking off an old coat and walking lightly away. On the contrary, it was like watching the house I had lived in my whole life being pulled down. I didn't just lose shelter. I lost the very concept of who I was. The things I had believed to be myself no longer stood firm, not because someone outside rejected them, but because I, in the rawest truth, saw them as temporary facades. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to lean on. I no longer knew what I was, no longer dared to assert anything, no longer trusted any description of myself. If that feeling had a name, it would be a kind of disintegration, not violent, but cold, like witnessing myself break into pieces. The definitions I had once defended, as if my life depended on them, now lay like shards of glass across the floor of my soul, beautiful in how they reflected light, but useless. I no longer wanted to prove anything. I no longer knew what to pursue. I no longer felt the need to rescue any image in that emptiness. I stopped resisting, and that surprised me. I did not feel suffering. There was a very deep, gentle sadness, but it did not drag me down. Instead, it allowed me to breathe in a way I hadn't remembered was possible. I was no longer anyone, and in that state, I began to see not to find a new answer or a new identity to replace the old, but to realize that I didn't have to be anything in order to be present. I was simply here. No labels, no descriptions, no need for reasons. A strange stillness spread through my mind. I looked around, and everything was the same. The sky was still blue, people still moved, the wind still passed through. Yet everything seemed more alive, not because they had changed, but because I no longer looked at them as if through the film of my old images. Through the lens of an eye that was trying to analyze or possess, I began to realize that the death of the ego does not arrive in some glorious instant the books often describe. It comes as a slow, dissolving process, in which everything I once clung to gradually falls away, and I stop clinging. I no longer strain to become me. I began to learn how to simply exist in silence, and perhaps in that very unmaking something was born, not a new ego, but an empty space where the old definitions no longer have purchase. Something deeper quietly begins to emerge there, inexpressible, ungraspable, yet unmistakably present. I don't know what it is, but for the first time in my life, I'm not in a hurry to name or capture it. I only understood that truth does not arrive after answers. It arrives after the collapse of what we once supposed to be true. And I was standing precisely at that place, where every definition of me had fallen away, and in the remaining void, something luminous and wordless was slowly appearing. In fact, in that moment, I didn't even know what I was doing. I simply stopped doing. I sat still, not to meditate, not to search, not to become anyone. You might call it exhaustion, after a long struggle in the maze of ego. You might call it surrender. Yet in that surrender there was no resentment, no expectation, no goal, only stillness, unforced and unintentional. A simple stillness, as if it had always been there and only now I agreed to rest in it so it could reveal itself. At first, the habitual thoughts kept coming, the familiar lines of questioning. What am I doing sitting here? Is this useful? Shouldn't I be using this time for something more meaningful? But this time I didn't chase them. I did not react, resist, or endorse. I simply looked not with the eye that analyzes but with a gaze that does not pass through the mind. In that way I was no longer the thinking self, but something behind it, quiet, clear, witnessing. Then, in a moment that felt utterly ordinary, I realized something in me was knowing. It knew that there were thoughts, breath, sensations, a hand resting on the thigh, yet that knowing did not speak. It did not announce, "I know." It had no name, no need for confirmation. It simply knew, plainly, and without reason. I could not call it I, because it had no definite form to be named. It was not like the self I had recognized as me. No opinions, no needs, no expectations. It did not want to become anyone, nor did it need recognition, and yet it was profoundly real. So real that everything else seemed like a thin veil laid over this transparent ground. I felt a peace I had never known, not the peace of solving a problem or of being comforted by someone, but a peace that arose because there was no longer any reason to be uneasy. There was no one to defend, nothing to prop up, nothing to prove. In that absolute simplicity, I found myself present without needing to be anything. Not every thought vanished. They still came and went like a gentle breeze across water. But now, I was no longer the water being stirred. I was the space that held the water. I cannot precisely describe what that island. All I can say is that it has always been present, but I had never noticed because I was too busy being someone. I had never stayed still long enough to see that. There is a quiet knowing that keeps witnessing everything, even the one I used to call me. I didn't want to leave that moment, but I also didn't need to hold on to it. It wasn't an experience to be clung to, it was simply the nature of being itself. As if I had returned to something ancient, primal, deeply real, and yet at the same time new, untouched, and fresh, like breathing for the very first time, like truly seeing, like simply being. And for the first time in my life I realized, I am not what I think. I am not the roles I have played. I am not the seeker searching for truth. I am the pure knowing itself, nameless, formless, ageless. I cannot say that I have found the truth, because truth does not arrive as an answer. It does not appear like the last page of a book where suddenly the whole story makes sense. It does not feel like a victory at the end of a long conquest. On the contrary, truth appears only when all attempts to understand, to grasp, to conquer have dissolved. And in that absolute silence, something that had never left begins to shine. I sat there, in the stillness of early morning. There was nothing more to think, nothing more to ask. Not because I was satisfied, but because suddenly, there was no one left to ask. The question that had burned in me for so long, who am I, no longer carried weight. Not because I had answered it, but because it was no longer necessary. Like a dream question that becomes meaningless the moment you wake up. I felt as if I had awakened from a long dream, where I was the center and life revolved around me. Now, everything, the trees, the light, the breath, the birdsong, was simply present, whole, complete. Not because of me, not belonging to me, not connected to any self. They were simply themselves, in absolute purity. And strangely, in that same moment, I too felt as if I was nothing at all, and yet also everything. There was no boundary between the seer and the seen. I was no longer a subject looking out at the world. It was as if life itself was aware of being alive through this body, in this moment. There was no one left to know. Only the silent, luminous knowing itself remained. And I could not describe it with words. Because every word I had ever used, I am, I think, I feel, had become unnecessary. They were just old echoes of a mental structure that had already fallen away. I no longer needed to be anything in order to exist. Not an improved image. Not a place in the world. Not an affirmation or a denial. This simple presence, formless, boundless, without need, was itself the answer, though it never needed to be spoken. And then it struck me. The very awareness that is now reading these words in you, silently witnessing life unfold without clinging, without reacting, that is what you truly are. But you cannot call it by a name, because every name comes after it. It is the ground beneath all things that rise and fall. The flawless mirror reflecting infinite forms. The light, uncreated and undying, present in every breath. I sat there not in joy, not in sorrow, simply in knowing. And in that knowing, everything was in its right place. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed reaching. Every person, every object, every moment was just what it was. No more, no less. I felt myself like a mist dissolving into the morning light, leaving no trace yet never gone, because I had never existed as something separate that could disappear. What I once called me was only a wave rising in the ocean. And now, the wave had recognized itself as water. I no longer felt the urge to tell more. Not because there is a secret, but because truth cannot be told. It is not a destination, it is the place we have always been. We were simply too busy becoming to notice that we already are. And now, I smile quietly. That old question, who am I, no longer needed. In the mirror of the soul, I no longer search for a definite form. I am the transparent mirror itself. I am the vast knowing that embraces every experience. In the end, the truth of who I am is silent, and yet unmistakably clear. Thank you for walking alongside Trit Tum. May you always have enough stillness to see clearly, and enough clarity to walk forward without fear.